5:47 a.m., February 19th, 2026. Norfolk, Virginia. 14 unmarked ATF vehicles moved in a slow convoy down East Little Creek Road, headlights off, engines barely audible over the wind coming off the Chesapeake Bay. Behind them, 6 FBI tactical units held position 2 blocks east, waiting for the signal. The target was a single-story commercial building at 2214 Deckman Avenue, a storefront with a faded sign that read Atlantic Surplus and Defensa Suppipli, LLC. The business had been operating for 11 years. The owner had passed every federal inspection. His federal firearms license was current. His paperwork was spotless. Underneath it all, 214 ghost weapons, 6 states, and a ledger that was about to take apart one of the most sophisticated small arms trafficking pipelines federal agents had documented in the Mid-Atlantic region in over a decade. Estimated value of illegal conversions and trafficked hardware in circulation, $4, $3 million. The warrants had been ready since the night before, 17 of them, executed simultaneously across Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. At exactly 5:51 a.m., the lead ATF agent gave the signal. The operation had a name. The paperwork called it Operation Clean Ledger. What agents would find inside that Norfolk storefront in the next 40 minutes would take months to fully process. The weapons, the cash, the vault, and a handwritten ledger, 4 years of transactions, that connected a federally licensed surplus dealer to street-level distributors, militia buyers, and conversion shops across half the eastern seaboard. But the case didn't start in Norfolk. It started 14 months earlier, in a Baltimore neighborhood that had seen its share of federal investigations, with a single recovered weapon and a serial number that should not have existed. That detail is worth pausing on. What makes this case different isn't the scale of the trafficking, or even the method. It's the mechanism. The way a legitimate federal license became the infrastructure for an illegal supply chain, invisible to regulators for over 4 years. A system designed to prevent exactly this kind of trafficking was exploited at its most trusted layer. The investigation that followed required 12 weeks of surveillance, wire intercepts, a confidential informant who nearly walked away twice, and a warrant package that took 3 federal prosecutors 6 weeks to assemble. Here is how it happened. In November 2025, a Baltimore ATF field agent named Marcus Webb was working a homicide case in the Bel Air Edison neighborhood. The killing itself wasn't unusual for the case load his unit was carrying. What was unusual was the weapon recovered at the scene. A MAC-10, semi-automatic pistol, 45 ACP caliber, manufactured in the mid-1980s. The kind of weapon that still circulates through legacy trafficking channels because it's durable, concealable, and produced in enough quantity that individual units are hard to trace. Agent Webb ran the serial number through the ATF database as a matter of routine procedure. What came back stopped him. The serial number was registered to a Navy decommission lot, a batch of weapons that had been administratively destroyed and documented as such in 2019. The paperwork listed the lot as processed through a federally licensed disposal contractor. The weapons in that lot, on paper, no longer existed, and yet one of them had just been used in a homicide in Baltimore. Webb flagged the discrepancy and escalated to the ATF Baltimore Field Division. Within 48 hours, the case had been assigned to a joint task force with the FBI's Baltimore Field Office. The central question was straightforward. How does a weapon documented as destroyed in 2019 turn up in active circulation in 2025, converted to full automatic fire? A federal felony. With the tooling marks of a professional machine shop? The answer required tracing the decommission lot backward through 6 years of federal procurement records. The Navy decommission lots in question had been processed through a government surplus auction system. Decommissioned equipment, electronics, vehicles, and in some cases non-functional weapons retained for training displays or historical collections, moves through federally licensed dealers who bid on lots at auction. The weapons themselves, when included in lots, are supposed to be rendered permanently inoperable before transfer. The ATF audits the paperwork documenting that process. The licensed dealer who had purchased the specific lot containing the MAC-10 serial number was Atlantic Surplus and Defense Supply, LLC, operating out of Norfolk, Virginia. Owner of record, Raymond Durrell Calloway, 54 years old, FFL license holder for 11 years, no criminal history, no prior ATF violations. A business that, on its surface, operated exactly as a legitimate surplus dealer should. purchasing Navy and DoD surplus at auction, reselling components, training equipment, and display items to contractors, collectors, law enforcement agencies, and institutional buyers across the country. The task force ran a preliminary financial check on Callaway's business. The numbers looked normal. Revenue consistent with the size of the operation. Inventory turnover typical for the sector. Nothing that flagged immediately. I spent time going through the ATF inspection records on this case, and one detail kept coming back. Callaway's business had been inspected 4 times over 11 years. Each inspection cleared him. The paperwork was, by every account, meticulous. Whatever was happening underneath the legitimate operation, it was structured to survive federal scrutiny from the top down. That's the first thing to understand about how this pipeline worked. It wasn't hidden from the system. It was threaded through it. The task force needed more than a serial number match. They needed a connection between the documented destruction of the lot and whatever had actually happened to the weapons inside it. That meant finding the machine shop. The full auto conversion on the recovered MA-10 was professional work, not a kitchen table modification, the kind that malfunctions under use. This was precise, tooled work requiring a milling machine and someone who knows what they're doing. The ATF forensic lab in Rockville identified the specific tooling marks from the conversion and compared them against records from registered machine shops in the Virginia-Maryland area. It took 11 days to get a match. The tooling signature matched equipment registered to a machine shop in Chesapeake, Virginia, approximately 12 miles from the Atlantic Surplus storefront in Norfolk. The shop was registered under a business name, but the ownership records connected to a single individual, Donovan Keith Whitfield, 47 years old, Raymond Callaway's brother-in-law. The investigation changed shape the moment that connection was established. What had started as a single weapon trace in Baltimore was now a potential organized trafficking operation anchored by a family network, operating across at least 2 businesses with a federally licensed surplus dealer at the center. The task force was reorganized. ATF and FBI resources were reallocated. Surveillance began on both the Norfolk storefront and the Chesapeake machine shop within days of the match being confirmed. Surveillance on both locations ran around the clock for the first 3 weeks. Agents documented Callaway's arrival at the storefront each morning, typically before 6 a.m., and his departure each evening. Vehicle traffic at the Chesapeake shop was logged. Delivery vans arriving without commercial markings, departing 30 to 90 minutes later. Foot traffic between the 2 locations occurred twice during the first week of coverage. The physical distance between the storefront and the machine shop was 12 miles by road. On 2 occasions in the first 10 days, investigators observed the same unmarked pickup truck making that run in both directions within a single business morning. What surveillance turned up over the following 12 weeks built the picture piece by piece. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Callaway's operation was, in every visible way, compliant. He filed his required records. He maintained his acquisition logs. He reported sales through the appropriate channels. The ATF inspections he had passed weren't cursory. Federal firearms dealers with his volume of business get scrutinized, and he came through clean, every time. The mechanism that made that possible was a separation of function that only became visible once investigators started watching the physical movement of goods. The decommissioned lots Callaway purchased at Navy surplus auctions contained a mix of items. Some were legitimately sold through the business. Some were documented as destroyed per regulatory requirements. But a subset of the weapons, specifically those in lots where the documented destruction was the weakest point of verification, were not being destroyed. They were being quietly transferred to Whitfield's machine shop in Chesapeake. At the shop, they were converted, full auto modifications, in some cases, suppressor attachments. The weapons came back to Callaway's operation as untraceable hardware. No serial number flagged in any active database because the last official record showed them as destroyed. Ghost weapons. That's the federal designation. Weapons that exist in the physical world but have been administratively removed from every database that would allow law enforcement to trace them. The task force had confirmed the mechanism. Now they needed to map the distribution chain. If you've ever had to build a criminal case from the ground up, working backward from a single data point, imagine doing that across 6 states with a network that had been operating quietly for 4 years and had never generated a single ATF complaint. Surveillance on Whitfield's machine shop documented regular transfers of packaged materials to a staging location in Portsmouth, Virginia. From there, the packages moved through what appeared to be a small logistics network. a combination of private couriers and commercial freight services using shipping manifests that listed the contents as machine parts and industrial hardware. The distribution reached east into Maryland and Pennsylvania, south into West Virginia and parts of Virginia, and west into Kentucky. A sixth pipeline ran into Ohio, though investigators believed that arm of the network was newer, possibly established within the 18 months prior to the investigation. The buyers at the end of those pipelines fell into two broad categories. The first, street-level distributors in Baltimore and Philadelphia. The weapons entering those cities were moving into criminal networks operating in neighborhoods where gun violence was already elevated. The ghost weapons were attractive to those buyers precisely because they were untraceable, no serial number that could connect a recovered weapon back to a source. The second category of buyer was different, a single buyer in rural Fleming County, Kentucky, a contact the task force identified through wire intercepts as having affiliations with a militia organization operating in eastern Kentucky. This buyer was acquiring weapons in larger quantities than the street-level distributors and appeared to be stockpiling rather than redistributing. The distinction matters. The weapons going to Baltimore and Philadelphia were entering active criminal use. The weapons going to Kentucky were accumulating. Both pipelines created different kinds of risk. Investigators flagged both in the warrant package that was eventually assembled. The task force requested and received authorization to conduct wire surveillance on Calloway's business phone and on Whitfield's shop. The intercepts ran for 6 weeks. During that time, the confidential informant, an individual with existing connections to the distribution network who had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators, became one of the most important assets in the case. The informant was not inside the Calloway operation itself, but was positioned at an intermediate point in the distribution chain, close enough to observe transaction patterns and relay information to the task force. There's a line in the task force operational summary that reads almost like it was written as an understatement. It notes that the informant's continued cooperation required ongoing case management due to concern about personal safety. That's the bureaucratic way of saying this individual was taking a significant personal risk, and the agents managing the case knew it. The informant provided 2 critical pieces of information over the course of the surveillance period. The first was confirmation of the buyer in Kentucky, the militia-affiliated contact, and the approximate frequency and volume of his acquisitions. The second was a detail the wire intercepts alone could not have established, the existence of a physical ledger. Calloway kept records, not digital records. A physical, handwritten ledger. A document that mapped transactions, buyer identities in coded form, dates, quantities, and dollar amounts over a 4-year period. The ledger was kept in the storefront, in a location the informant described as a secured area beneath the main floor of the building. The existence of the ledger changed the calculus of the operation significantly. A ledger of that nature, if recovered, would be among the most complete pieces of documentary evidence in a trafficking case of this kind. It would allow investigators to identify buyers who had not been identified through surveillance or intercepts. It would establish the full scope of the network in a way that witness testimony and electronic evidence alone could not. The warrant package was restructured to prioritize recovery of the ledger. What's most surprising about this case isn't the scale of the trafficking or even the sophistication of the mechanism. It's what Calloway was risking and why. By the time investigators assembled the full picture, Atlantic, Surplus, and Defense Supply was generating legitimate revenue. The surplus business was real. Calloway had built something that worked. The illegal pipeline was a layer underneath a functioning legal operation, an operation that gave him cover but also gave him an alternative. He didn't need the trafficking income to survive financially. What agents couldn't fully answer, even after the warrants were executed and Calloway was in custody, was what had driven the decision to run both operations simultaneously. Whether it was money, something owed to someone in the distribution network, or something else entirely. The case record doesn't give a clean answer. That ambiguity says something about the limits of even a successful federal investigation. The warrant package was complete by February 16, 2026. 3 federal prosecutors reviewed it. The document ran to 847 pages, including surveillance logs, wire intercept transcripts, forensic analysis from the ATF lab, financial records, and the affidavit establishing probable cause for all 17 simultaneous warrants. The tactical planning for the simultaneous execution began in parallel. 17 locations across 6 states, 22 individuals to be taken into custody. A primary target site, the Norfolk storefront, that required a specialized entry plan because of the potential for the secured vault beneath the floor to contain additional weapons. Here is where the operation almost ran into its first serious complication. 48 hours before the scheduled execution date, the confidential informant made contact with the task force case agent and reported that there were indications someone in the distribution network had become nervous. Not specific information about a leak, but behavioral changes in the network, buyers going quiet. A contact in the Baltimore distribution chain had cancelled a scheduled exchange without explanation. The task force convened an emergency assessment. The options were accelerate the operation by 48 hours, proceed as planned on the 19th, or hold the warrants and continue surveillance until the concern either resolved or escalated. Accelerating the operation was the preference of the tactical teams, who had their staging in place and were ready to move. Holding the warrants carried the risk that if the network had been tipped, evidence would begin disappearing. Proceeding as planned on the 19th meant accepting the possibility that the network was already partially aware. The decision came from the ATF special agent in charge of the operation: proceed as planned. The warrant package was too comprehensive, and the simultaneous nature of the execution too important to disrupt. If the network had been partially alerted, the simultaneous execution would still prevent coordination between locations. At 5:51 a.m. on February 19, 2026, the operation began. The Norfolk storefront was the primary objective. ATF agents entered through the front and rear access points simultaneously. Calloway was on the premises. He had arrived at the building approximately 90 minutes before the raid, which investigators later determined was his normal practice. He was taken into custody without resistance within the first 4 minutes of entry. He was seated at a metal desk in the back office when agents came through the rear door, a cup of coffee still steaming beside him. He did not reach for anything. He did not speak. According to the agent who placed him in handcuffs, Calloway looked at the agents for a long moment, then looked down at the surface of the desk and said nothing at all. The building had a secondary space below the main storefront floor, accessible through what appeared to be a standard utility access hatch in the back storage room. The hatch was secured with a reinforced lock. ATF agents with the appropriate tools breached it in under 8 minutes. The vault beneath the floor was approximately 12 feet by 18 feet, humidity controlled, shelved on 3 walls. What was inside required a full afternoon to catalogue. 87 weapons, all in various stages of conversion, some awaiting machine shop work, some already modified and packaged. ATF forensic teams identified MAC-10s, modified AR platform rifles, and a number of suppressor-equipped handguns, all in configurations illegal under federal law. None of the weapons had active serial numbers in any law enforcement database. $340,000 in cash, stacked in currency bundles, organized by denomination. And the ledger. A black hardbound journal, approximately 200 pages. Handwritten entries in a combination of abbreviated codes and plain language. Dates running from early 2022 through February 15, 2026, 4 days before the raid. Transaction records for 214 weapons. Buyer identifiers. Dollar amounts. Delivery notes. One prosecutor later described it in a filing as the most complete self-documentation of a trafficking operation the office had prosecuted in the prior decade. Calloway's defense attorneys would later argue that the ledger was inadmissible. That argument did not succeed. Simultaneously, across the 5 other states, the remaining warrant executions proceeded. Whitfield's machine shop in Chesapeake was secured without incident. Equipment consistent with the forensic profile of the conversions was seized, including a milling machine and precision tooling that matched the marks identified in the original ATF lab analysis from November 2025. In Maryland, 3 individuals connected to the Baltimore distribution network were arrested at 2 separate locations. Both sites yielded additional weapons, a combined total of 23 ghost-converted firearms consistent with the type and methodology documented at the Norfolk vault. In Pennsylvania, arrests at 2 Philadelphia area locations, 14 additional weapons recovered. In West Virginia and Ohio, the network's newer arms generated smaller individual hauls, but the individuals arrested there provided information during post-arrest interviews that extended the scope of the investigation further west than the original warrant package had mapped. The Kentucky operation was the most logistically complex. The buyer with militia affiliations was located on a rural property in Fleming County. The execution required coordination between ATF tactical teams and local law enforcement. The property contained multiple structures. Agents secured the primary residence and 2 outbuildings. 41 weapons were recovered on the property, a significantly higher individual count than any other location outside of the Norfolk vault. The individual was taken into custody. Federal charges included unlawful receipt and possession of machine guns under the National Firearms Act, as well as conspiracy to traffic in illegal firearms. The militia organization he was affiliated with was not charged as an entity, but the investigation generated referrals to other federal units for ongoing assessment. 22 arrests total, 17 warrant locations, 6 states. The operation ran from 5:51 a.m. to approximately 2:30 p.m. on February 19th. Here's the take that will probably get some pushback. The real failure in this case wasn't Callaway's deception. It was the verification gap in federal destruction documentation for decommissioned weapons. ATF's inspection process is designed to audit what a dealer has, not to independently verify what they claim to have destroyed. Callaway exploited the difference between those two things for 4 years across 11 inspection cycles. That isn't just one man's fraud. It's a structural vulnerability the ATF had not closed as of the date of this investigation, and which the agency's own post-case review acknowledged in a report filed in April 2026. He ran a ghost weapons pipeline through the inspection system, not by evading it, but by understanding exactly where its documentation requirements ended. Callaway entered a guilty plea in May 2026. Federal charges included conspiracy to traffic in illegal firearms, unlawful transfer of machine guns, and fraud related to federal firearms licensing. Specifically, the falsification of destruction records. Sentencing was scheduled for September 2026. The prosecution's recommended sentencing range, based on federal guidelines and the scope of the trafficking, was 19 to 24 years. Donovan Whitfield, the operator of the Chesapeake machine shop, entered a separate guilty plea in April 2026. Charges: conspiracy, unlawful manufacture of machine guns, and aiding and abetting the trafficking operation. Sentencing pending. The 22 individuals arrested across the 6 states entered various combinations of guilty pleas and trial elections. The cases in Baltimore and Philadelphia, involving street-level distribution, moved through the federal dockets in Maryland and the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. The Kentucky buyers case remained in federal court in the Eastern District of Kentucky as of the last available reporting. What do you think? Did a system that passed Callaway 11 times bear any responsibility for the 4 years of damage his pipeline caused, or does the responsibility end with the individual who exploited it? The ledger. All 214 entries allowed investigators to build individual cases against buyers who had not been identified during the surveillance phase of the investigation. As of June 2026, approximately 31 additional individuals had been named in federal indictments as a result of ledger evidence. Those cases were working through the courts across 5 jurisdictions. The total number of ghost weapons believed to have entered criminal circulation through the pipeline, prior to recovery, between 127 and 189 units. The range reflects uncertainty in the ledger coding. Some entries were ambiguous as to whether a transaction had been completed or was still pending at the time of the raid. ATF analysts working through the documentation settled on a most likely figure of 161 weapons in active circulation that were not recovered during the February 19th operation. 161 weapons. In 6 states. Untraceable. The task force issued recovery alerts and coordinated with local law enforcement agencies in the regions where the distribution network had operated. As of the available record, 43 of those weapons had been recovered through subsequent law enforcement actions, including 6 at crime scenes. The remaining 100-plus units remained unaccounted for. One detail about this case that didn't get much coverage outside of the federal filings: the individual who first flagged the behavioral changes in the distribution network. The nervous buyers, the cancelled exchanges that preceded the raid by 48 hours. That concern turned out to be accurate. One contact in the Pennsylvania arm of the network had received a warning from someone whose identity the task force was not able to establish with certainty. The warning was vague and came too late for the network to act on it. But it was real. The source of that warning was never identified. The investigation generated a referral to a separate internal review, but as of the available record, no individual was charged in connection with it. Whether the leak came from inside the investigation, from someone adjacent to the court system, or from somewhere else entirely, the case record doesn't close that loop. Will networks structured like this one emerge again in the military surplus sector? The conditions that enabled it, federal auction access, documentation gaps in destruction verification, the sheer volume of decommissioned hardware moving through the system, haven't changed in any fundamental way since February 2026. Comment yes or no. The ATF's post-case review, published in April 2026, recommended procedural changes to the destruction verification process for surplus weapons lots. Whether those recommendations result in implemented policy changes within the federal procurement system is a separate question from whether Raymond Callaway has been held accountable for what his operation did. Those are two different problems. The first is solved by prosecution. The second requires institutional change that investigations alone can't produce. If this case is part of a pattern that concerns you, subscribe to this channel. The next investigation goes deeper into the federal systems that track where military hardware ends up after it leaves active service. There's more in that story than what made the indictments. The ledger recovered from beneath the Norfolk storefront contained 214 entries. Prosecutors worked through all of them. The cases they generated are moving through the federal system. The weapons Callaway put into circulation, the ones not recovered, are still out there. The surplus dealer's license was his pipeline. It was also, in the end, the document trail that made the case against him airtight. Raymond Callaway is awaiting sentencing. The network he built across 6 states is dismantled. The gap in federal documentation that made it possible still exists.